First and foremost, we're going to be describing the pillars of zero trust, just so we have some basis of understanding where we're starting from, and then we're going to go through identity aspects of it and kind of move on from there. So as shown on your screen here, these are the 6 pillars of zero trust on identity, devices, applications, data, infrastructure, and networks. This discussion will be over the identity pieces of this and how it relates to the zero trust model. There will be some slight aspects that touch close to the devices, but that will be a different episode. So we're going to kind of dive right into this. This diagram illustrates the identity and the devices and where they actually fall into the zero trust kind of map. We're going to be kind of going over how MFAs tied into this, how the authentication's configured, as well as how it relates to zero trust policies and conditional access. So these maps will make much more sense as we get a little bit further down this path of ours. So to start, we're going to be starting with MFA and why MFA is so important. In case anyone on this call does not know, MFA is a security system that requires more than one method of authentication to verify that that user's identity is who they claim to be. Generally, those have to be independent categories. Obviously, you wouldn't want MFA on the same exact system as, say, like their logins or anything like that. So it's generally either a mobile device, a FIDO key, even SMS texting counts, although that's still not a preferred method. MFA works by adding an additional layer of security, making it harder for attackers to gain access to a person's device or online accounts, because knowing the victim's password is no longer enough to gain access to that account. As it relates to zero trust, MFA is just one of many components. Many organizations think MFA is enough, and in many cases, it is not. And I cannot stress that enough. It is a good start. I believe the math of the stats had it at roughly 99% of identity attacks are thwarted by MFA, but it does still leave that 1%. And there is token hijacking and a couple other things you can do to kind of get around that. But that's why we're going over the zero trust model, because you should never rely solely on identity. Hence the 6 pillars. All right, so let's get started with MFA. Now, to clarify, there are 2 types of MFA as it relates to Office 365. The first and foremost is what is called per user MFA. Now, per user MFA, you're going to want to generally stay away from unless you're not going down the zero trust model, because that is the legacy kind of MFA deployment. So we're going to kind of walk through how to actually get to that. So what I'm going to do is go to Azure Active Directory, or what's now called Intra, which is just intra.microsoft.com. And over on the left side, under identity, and then under our all users, we're going to click this per users MFA option here. This is going to bring up a list of all your user objects. And if you have per user MFA, the reason I want to go over this first and foremost is because if you are using per user MFA, meaning that you have users in here that are enabled, and you're using conditional access or other technologies that we're going to be covering on this call, you're going to have issues. Your users are going to have inconsistent auth prompts. They won't seem to line up with your policies. This is a one or the other kind of MFA discussion. And that's why it gets somewhat confusing with Microsoft, because many people confuse the per user MFA with conditional access policies, which is what we'll be describing today. So in short, if you're not going down the zero trust route, per user MFA is okay to use. But if you are going down this route and wanting to have a much more holistic approach to security, avoid per user MFA if at all possible. You'll just be chasing down a bunch of stuff you don't want to chase down. So outside of the per user MFA, we have our, let me get back to Intra, our authentication methods that are handled through conditional access, which conditional access will be going over the policies in our next segment. But for this next piece, we're going to be just breaking down into the different MFA methods, how they're configured, where they're configured, so that you can kind of adjust them to your organization. And then we'll get into how we apply those policies through conditional access as it relates to the identity. So going to our methods, we're going to go again under identity in the Intra portal and under protection, and we're going to go down to authentication methods. These are the policies that are currently allowed to be used within your organization for MFA as it's described within conditional access. This will make much more sense when we're looking at the conditional access policies, as we're able to set a policy to require an MFA method before allowing them onward, or to require multiples, or to require a compliant device, but we'll get into conditional access. So as it relates to authentication methods, you can kind of see here, these are the supported mechanisms for MFA. It is very highly recommended on both Microsoft's side and ours that Microsoft Authenticator be used. It seems to be the most consistent, most solid. Everyone has a cell phone. It seems to be most secure and easily deployed. FIDO keys are also a very good option. Same with hardware OAuth keys, although those are in technical preview. SMS as a last option, and email is very last option. Certificate-based authentication has additional requirements. We're not going to get into those on this call, but if you do have any questions on how to go about doing that and what licensing would be required, definitely let me know and I'll send over the information. All right. So pitfalls and kind of concerns that you may run into when deploying this in your organization. Microsoft has placed the registration of MFA behind Azure AD P2 licensing. So by default, you're not able to start what's called a registration campaign or establish a registration policy forcing your users to auth. However, registration is forced on first challenge. So if you are going to be implementing MFA within the Microsoft stack and you're not wanting to go to an Azure AD P2 license for the registration campaigns, what you can do is scope your conditional access policies in a way that it will challenge your users at least once, and that will force that registration. Just know until a challenge occurs, registration does not occur. That can actually get you into a rather dangerous situation if, for example, you whitelist an IP address of one of your locations to not have to MFA, but you never enforced any type of registration. You may have accounts that have never logged in outside of that one environment, such as at the office. And if their account gets compromised, whoever compromised it will be challenged for their MFA and will just register it to themselves. So that is something to kind of keep in mind, that you need to be so mindful of your registration procedures and making sure everyone's covered. Now, there's plenty of ways to do that, which I'll be happy to assist with to prevent what I would consider MFA exhaustion. Obviously, you don't want your users having to MFA all of the time, but to enforce the registration, it's well worth it, at least for the initial one. So additionally, there are user registration details that will kind of come up in here and give you your actual reports on how many people have registered, how they're currently registering, who's currently using them, and where at. So you will have visibility in terms of which methodologies are the most used within your environment. Additionally, I want to point out, we're going to go over this briefly in conditional access here momentarily, but these different methods can actually be assigned different values in terms of authentication strength as it relates to your organization. And you're able to scope certain policies to require different ones based on the resource being accessed. So if you do have some super sensitive areas or super sensitive resources that you only want very narrow use case users using, you can mix and match these and, for example, hand them some actual hardware FIDO keys that will only allow access to those resources. So just know it gets very granular depending on how detailed you need to go. All right. So now that we've covered MFA, registration, the authentication methods, and the main snag of per user versus conditional access, we're going to get into conditional access. So conditional access does not have any type of individual per user MFA screen as you had seen prior. It is all controlled on the back end, and all you can really control is the methods that they are able to MFA with and who needs to based on what conditions, and then what to do with them past that. So we're going to start with going over what is conditional access, when to use it, and its kind of utility. This is actually one of my more favorite security features around the Zero Trust stack because of the amount of visibility into the devices it has, as well as into the identities and forced sign-in risk detection. So conditional access is a tool used to implement automated access controls decisions for accessing your cloud applications based on conditions, where basically we're defining the conditions that they have to meet to access your resources. Going back to that Zero Trust model, this is one of the main critical components of it. Conditional access is critical as it allows for more flexible and adaptive security strategy, and that's very true. Helps ensure that only the right individuals under the right conditions have access to your organizational data. So we're going to go through a practical example of conditional access policies here so we can kind of go over it. So we're going to start with, let's say, for example, this one. This is our device compliance enforcement. This policy, which should be currently targeted to all users. and to almost all apps, although we do exclude our jump box from this. And we'll kind of get into why we're doing that later. But as you can see here in the conditional access policies, you're defining who is at scope 2, what resources you're wanting to protect. I also want to point out that one thing that may not be known here is that any service principals that you may have added to your organization, either through Azure VPN or through an additional single sign-on, they will all be listed here. So this is kind of what they meant by the amount of granularity that's possible with conditional access. You can have it so much so that a single web app is only accessible by certain people and only in certain timeframes and only if they have their FIDO key. You can get extremely granular with it. So let me actually just discard my changes there. So as you know, we define the users and who to include and who to exclude based on group memberships or otherwise, what resources and cloud applications we should include or exclude from this, as well as if it should apply to the user's action or actual cloud apps. The conditions of that access attempt. So this is where you're defining the criteria that this policy would be scoped to. So for example, you may want to have this only apply to those that have been identified as being low to medium or high risk. An example of a low risk might be a unrecognized device or a geographic location somewhat close to where they're normally at. And high would be a compromised account that's an administrative account that was compromised in a way that they couldn't have physically traveled there in time, or it's from a known bad actor's IP address, et cetera. So, and Microsoft's AI pretty much determines that priority. Additionally, we have the sign-in risks, same concept. We're able to scope certain ones to certain risk levels. Certain device platforms, this can become very important if you're trying to, for example, onboard Android in a certain way versus iOS, or if you're needing to, say, block iOS access to email after hours. In some states, I believe that's an issue with overtime. So you are able to come in here and create policies to kind of prevent that and scope them solely to them. Additionally, any locations that are related. So very similar to taking the core concept of zero trust, that we're bringing in all the possible telemetry data on the logins and analyzing it, locations being one of them. That includes running it against a list that you define, such as all trusted locations. And this would be your corporate offices, for example, because if you're getting attacked on the cloud side from your own office, you probably have bigger problems. Kind of getting into the client apps. Now, the client apps are what they're actually using to connect with. So this would be if they're using a browser or if they're using their desktop client, such as Outlook, Word, etc., OneDrive, etc. And then you actually have your filters, so you can filter them only to certain devices that meet your certain criteria. So for example, if you wanted to target this policy only for hybrid AD joined machines within Texas, you could do so. So past that, we're going to get into the actual access controls, which is where the fun starts. Your grant or block is pretty much determining the action of this policy if all other conditions are met. So for example, this one is going to grant access, but it's going to require that the device be marked as compliant, or at the very least, they're going to have to MFA. At the very bottom of here is a very important control saying that all of these have to be met or only one of them has to be met. And so this is relatively important, because if you don't pay attention to which one of these you've selected, and you may have selected multiples of these, you may not have intended them to be an all selected controls, may run into a problem. For example, in an Azure AD joined machine, if the require to be hybrid joined is checkmarked and it's set to all, they're not going to have this policy applied to them. Right. Other than that, let's see. We also have the session controls that we're kind of going over. Session controls are helping to determine the sign-in frequency, how often they're needing to assess their logins, as well as continuous access evaluation. That's where the tokens are constantly reanalyzed and rechecked instead of just on the refresh period, as well as some rather complicated and license restricted options, such as using the conditional access app control, where we're able to actually block downloads of any application that they access through this system, and obviously that being those web applications. So if you have single sign-on and everything implemented, and let's say you have a SharePoint location or a web service that's relatively sensitive and you want to prevent downloads from across the board, that's where you would do that, because it would actually form a app proxy and prevent any downloads of any sort from being able to be brought down to the machine. So you kind of see how crazy complicated and detailed you can kind of get with your conditional access policies. At the very, very minimum, I would very highly suggest, unless you're doing quite a lot of international work, that you at the very least do a geo block. This is where we define certain locations as being unacceptable. And basically, if they're outside of the United States, we're just assuming a block by default because we don't have staff out there. And unfortunately, 80-90% of attacks seem to stem from outside the US. So at the very least, that's the bare minimum. Additionally, require MFA for all users should be set if it isn't already. You should be forcing that. We also have an additional one here to force MFA on all admins when accessing any admin control panel. And that's in addition to PIM, which we'll be going over next. And then we have our Android and iOS ones that are forcing app protection policies on the devices. There's a couple of important things I want to point out about conditional access here that are relatively important. One is that the authentication, or I should say the processing of these policies, happens after the authentication context. What that means is that until the account has been verified as being the credentials are correct, these policies do not run. So these are more of a safety net should an account be compromised, because then it's going to start checking against the conditional access policies. What country are they in? What device are they on? Is that device compliant? And then based on those policies, do we force MFA? Do we lock the account, etc.? Now, I know this is focusing on identity, but I did want to touch on one of the more powerful pieces of conditional access before I move on to PIM, and that is this device compliance. The compliance piece of this is actually extremely powerful. Let me get right here. There it is. Required device to be marked as compliant. If you're using Intune in your environment, this is an extremely powerful piece of software, because what this basically does is allow you to define the patch level, operating system level, certain applications needing to be on the machine, AV being up to date, any number of things that you would like to define a device as quote unquote compliant. And if a device isn't compliant, it will not allow them to access company resources. So that's where you can kind of get into this. They have to be up to date. They have to be domain joined, or they have to be under our security guidelines. Otherwise, they can't touch anything within our environment. It's a very powerful piece that we'll be going over when we do the device side of Zero Trust. All right, so let's pivot over to PIM. So PIM is Privileged Identity Management. Now, PIM is a service that enables you to manage, control, and monitor access within your organization. Now, we'll be going over the administration access pieces of this. However, it is applicable to other areas in an organization. But PIM is essential for minimizing risks associated with privileged accounts. Again, we're working under the Zero Trust model, so least security wherever possible. I, for example, or any other technical resource over at Plow are not admins. However, we have the ability to promote ourselves to admins, which we'll kind of walk you through, and that's pretty much PIM. So, ensure that only authorized users have administrative access and only when needed. That is spot on. So what is PIM? So PIM is Privileged Access Management, and we have a shortcut here at Plow to it, but it's really just a redirect and goes to the same place. But this is our Privileged Identity Management that every technical resource has to use before making any changes. There are 3 areas in PIM that are supported currently, but these are expanding. One is administration roles, as you can kind of see here. If, for example, I wanted the global administrator role, which I believe I currently have, I can activate here. I can fill out my rationale for it, the duration. I don't have any approvers given my role, but you can also add additional approvers in there. We'll kind of go over each of the settings here shortly. You also have them be members of groups. In this example, this is our delegated admin group. So if, for example, I'm needing to reset a password for one of our CSP customers, I come in here, activate it, provide the ticket number that we're doing it for. Wait a moment, they'll add me to the group I need to be a member of for this permission to work, and I can then access those resources, and that will remove that role automatically at the end of that timer. Outside of roles and groups, we also have Azure resources. This is where we're able to define certain areas or subscriptions, resource groups that only people have access to if they request it. So we're going to kind of go into the settings, and it's going to make a lot more sense here momentarily. So let me get over to that. So that's identity governance. All right, identity governance, and then privileged identity management. So inside here is where we'll actually see the different configurations for those three elements. We're going to start with roles just to kind of give you guys an idea of how this works. So if I were to come in here into the administrative roles, which these are them, and let's say we wanted to add the requirement for approval for someone to, for example, be able to change the authentication methods that are used by your staff. So what we can do is we can add an assignment. Assignments are basically who can promote themselves to this role. As you can kind of see here, we have an admin level 1, and that's where our first level kind of technicians here at Plow exist. So they have the ability to request this role. You can actually see who's currently has it, which no one has, and any of them that have currently expired. Under role settings is where everything's kind of defined in terms of how long it should last. Should it require justification or an additional ticket information? Should it require the approval of a coworker before accepting it? So this is where you put in your management or your IT directors to approve those roles before being handed out. And then also a few other things such as permanent assignments and how long to leave them there for. The last piece that's kind of important is the notifications. By default, only those admins that are currently promoted will receive notifications when others promote themselves. However, that can be changed here. We also have it notify you if someone even becomes eligible for that administration role. So obviously the idea here is that you gain a lot of visibility as no one's really an admin, and they have to justify why they're asking for admin access before being granted it. That allows you to also add in approval processes, documentation, ticket numbers, etc. All right, so groups function almost exactly the same way. You define a group that they're eligible to join, and you can define the exact same kind of settings and the differences between the members and the owners. Same concept, how long do they require tickets? Does it require approval to even be added? How long should the assignment be active for? And who needs to be notified when someone actually requests that permission? Azure resources, as mentioned earlier, we don't have this currently in place, but this will be rolled out here at Plow here very shortly. This is where we're able to pretty much define a subscription, for example. Let's just say like our optimization engine. If I wanted to only allow certain resources the ability to access those, I can by scoping them to this policy, and then they would have the exact same ability to not have rights to it and honoring the least privileged design philosophy while being able to just go to access and select the role, justify why they need it, wait a couple seconds, and then they have the access that they need. And then a few hours later, that access is removed. That's the entire system of PIM.